Morning often arrives quietly in the Appalachian Mountains, with mist settling between ancient ridges and long stretches of forest, revealing little beyond the next bend in the trail. For most hikers, those woods become a place of remarkable beauty and solitude. For others, they become the last place they're ever seen. In these mountains, experienced backpackers have disappeared within walking distance of rescue, violent crimes have unfolded in remote shelters, and searches involving hundreds of people have ended with the forest refusing to give up clear answers. As you move deeper along the Appalachian Trail, the investigation extends far beyond a single case. Hidden among weathered shelters, forgotten campsites, mountain summits, and generations of eyewitness accounts is a collection of mysteries connected by the same wilderness. Some are preserved in official records, others survive only through testimony and local tradition, but together they raise a question that has lingered for decades. Why does this trail continue to leave so many stories unfinished? The vanishing of Geraldine Largay. The Appalachian Trail stretches for more than 2,000 miles through some of the oldest mountains in North America, winding across forests that have changed surprisingly little despite centuries of settlement. Most days the trail feels carefully marked and reassuringly familiar, with white blazes leading hikers from one ridge to the next. Yet there are places where the woods seem to absorb every sound, where thick spruce and fir close in on both sides of the path, and where stepping only a short distance away can transform an ordinary walk into a bewildering maze. In those moments, the difference between confidence and confusion can be measured in only a few steps, and the wilderness has a way of reminding even experienced hikers that it rarely offers second chances. The remote section of Maine known as the 100-Mile Wilderness has earned a reputation unlike any other stretch of the Appalachian Trail. Despite the intimidating name, it is not exactly 100 miles long, nor is it untouched by people. Logging roads cross portions of the region, ponds are scattered throughout the landscape, and occasional camps or cabins exist beyond the trees. Even so, it remains one of the most isolated sections of the entire trail. Cell service is unreliable or non-existent, rescue can take hours or even days, and the forest is so dense that visibility often extends only a short distance beyond the trail itself. Hikers preparing for this section are routinely warned that once they enter, they must rely largely on themselves. By the summer of 2013, Geraldine "Jerry" Largay had already proven she possessed the determination required for such a journey. Born in Tennessee, she had spent much of her adult life as a registered nurse before retiring. Friends described her as warm, thoughtful, and adventurous rather than reckless. Hiking the Appalachian Trail had become a long-held dream shared with her husband George, who supported her attempt to complete the trail in sections before eventually committing to a northbound through hike. Like many hikers, she adopted a trail name. Fellow backpackers knew her simply as Inchworm, a nickname reflecting her steady pace rather than remarkable speed. She was 66 years old when she began her through hike. Age did not discourage her. The Appalachian Trail attracts hikers from nearly every stage of life, and Jerry approached the challenge with careful preparation instead of youthful haste. She travelled with modern backpacking equipment, carried maps, kept in contact whenever possible, and arranged regular meetings with her husband at road crossings where he supplied food and encouragement. Their system had worked well for months. George would meet her at predetermined locations, and after a short visit, Jerry would continue deeper into the mountains while he drove ahead to the next rendezvous point. By July, she had already completed thousands of difficult miles. She had crossed 14 states, endured changing weather, climbed countless mountains, and navigated terrain that had forced many hikers to abandon their attempts. Her experience mattered because it challenged one of the most common assumptions surrounding wilderness disappearances. Jerry was not an inexperienced visitor wandering into an unfamiliar country. She understood trail etiquette, navigation, and the importance of remaining on marked paths. She had already succeeded where many others had failed. On the morning of July 26, 2013, Jerry entered another day of hiking in Maine's 100-mile wilderness. The weather was typical for midsummer in northern New England. The forests were thick, insects persistent, and the trail narrowed beneath towering trees. Nothing suggested that this day would become one of the Appalachian Trail's most enduring mysteries. At some point during the morning, Jerry stepped off the Appalachian Trail for what investigators believe was a routine bathroom break. Such brief departures are an ordinary part of long-distance hiking. Backpackers are taught to leave the trail far enough to ensure privacy before returning to continue their journey. Usually the process lasts only a few minutes. For reasons that remain impossible to determine with certainty, Jerry never found her way back. Exactly how she became disoriented has been reconstructed largely through evidence discovered much later. Investigators believe she likely turned in the wrong direction after finishing her brief stop. Dense forest can erase visual landmarks almost immediately. White trailblazers disappear behind trees. Sound becomes muffled. Every direction begins to resemble the last. Even experienced hikers can lose their sense of orientation surprisingly quickly, especially when visibility is limited. Instead of relocating the trail within moments, Jerry appears to have continued walking, believing she was heading toward it. As the hours passed, she realized she was lost. One of the most heartbreaking pieces of evidence would not be discovered until years later. Jerry carried a cell phone despite the area's limited coverage. Although she had no signal, the device occasionally attempted to connect to distant towers. She repeatedly wrote text messages addressed to her husband, knowing they would likely remain unsent unless service appeared. Those messages offered investigators an extraordinary window into her final days. She apologized for getting lost. She reassured George that she loved him. She expressed hope that rescuers would eventually find her. Most painfully, she remained remarkably calm during the earlier stages of her ordeal, believing rescue would come before long. When Jerry failed to arrive at her scheduled meeting with George, concern quickly replaced routine expectation. Initially, there was reason to believe she had simply been delayed. Long-distance hiking often involves slower than expected progress due to weather, terrain, or fatigue. But as more time passed without any sign of her, the possibility of a serious emergency became unavoidable. Search efforts began almost immediately. The response eventually became one of the largest search operations in Maine's history. Hundreds of volunteers joined professional search and rescue teams. Helicopters flew above the forest canopy. Tracking dogs searched the ground. Wardens, game officials, and experienced wilderness search specialists combed the region around the point where Jerry had last been seen. The search concentrated heavily along the Appalachian Trail itself. This strategy reflected standard wilderness search principles. Lost hikers are often found close to established routes because they either remain where they realize they are lost or attempt to retrace their steps toward familiar landmarks. Search teams examined side trails, shelters, streams, logging roads, and likely travel corridors. Despite enormous effort, they found nothing. No backpack, no campsite, no clear footprints, no definitive indication of which direction Jerry had traveled after leaving the trail. As weeks turned into months, theories multiplied. Some questioned whether an accident had occurred near water. Others wondered whether she had suffered a medical emergency. There was even limited speculation about foul play, although investigators found no evidence supporting that possibility. The simplest explanation remained that Jerry had become lost in one of the most difficult environments imaginable. Yet even that theory raised troubling questions. How could someone disappear so completely? The answer became clearer only after later discoveries. Unknown to rescuers at the time, Jerry had established a small campsite roughly 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. 2 miles may sound insignificant on a map, but within the dense forests of Maine, it represented an almost impenetrable barrier. Thick vegetation restricted visibility to only a few yards in places. Searchers could pass surprisingly close without ever noticing someone concealed among trees, brush, and uneven ground. At her improvised campsite, Jerry made deliberate attempts to increase her chances of survival. She rationed food. She remained largely in one location. She used emergency supplies carefully. Most importantly, evidence later suggested she understood one of the basic principles taught to lost hikers. Once thoroughly disoriented, staying in one place often gives rescuers the best chance of finding you. Tragically, that advice depends on searchers looking in the correct area. For nearly 3 weeks after disappearing, Jerry continued documenting her situation through text messages and written notes. Although most of the texts never transmitted, the phone preserved them. They revealed neither panic nor irrational thinking. Instead, they showed someone struggling to remain hopeful while accepting the frightening possibility that help might not arrive in time. One message expressed love for her family. Another apologized repeatedly. The words have since become some of the most haunting records ever recovered from an Appalachian Trail disappearance, because they documented a person who knew exactly what had happened while remaining powerless to change it. Eventually, search operations were scaled back. This decision reflected difficult realities rather than lack of effort. Large wilderness searches cannot continue indefinitely at full intensity. Resources become limited, volunteers return home, weather changes, and the probability of survival gradually decreases with time. Official searches ended. Hope did not. George Largay continued believing that answers might still emerge. Family members, volunteers, and members of the hiking community never entirely abandoned the search. Jerry's disappearance became widely discussed among Appalachian trail hikers, serving as both a warning and an enduring mystery. Then, more than 2 years later, an unexpected discovery finally provided part of the answer. In October 2015, a surveyor working for the Navy was conducting routine work in the woods when he noticed a weathered tent hidden among the trees. The location lay off the Appalachian Trail in an area that had not been searched thoroughly during the original operation. Inside the tent were Jerry's remains. Also recovered were her backpack, personal belongings, written notes, and the cell phone containing unsent messages to George. The discovery confirmed what investigators had long suspected. She had never wandered endlessly across the forest. Instead, she had remained remarkably close to a single location, waiting for rescue that never came. Perhaps the most astonishing revelation involved the geography itself. Although Jerry had died in an isolated patch of forest, she was not impossibly far from civilization. Logging roads existed within a few miles. Other people occasionally passed through the broader region. Yet dense terrain, limited visibility, and the sheer scale of the wilderness had hidden her campsite from one of the most extensive search efforts the state had ever conducted. Experts later examined the search to understand what had gone wrong. Rather than exposing major failures, many concluded that Jerry's case illustrated the extraordinary difficulty of wilderness search and rescue. Search teams can unknowingly miss individuals even when operating nearby. Forests distort sound. Terrain redirects movement. Human perception is imperfect, especially when confronted with endless repetition of trees, rocks, and undergrowth. The case has since influenced discussions about navigation, emergency communication devices, and search strategy for long-distance hikers. Many now carry personal locator beacons or satellite messengers capable of transmitting distress signals without relying on cellular service. These technologies have dramatically improved rescue outcomes in similar situations, though they were far less common among recreational hikers in 2013. Even with modern equipment, Jerry's story continues to unsettle experienced backpackers because it challenges assumptions about proximity and safety. She was not hundreds of miles beyond rescue. She did not disappear into some mythical wilderness beyond human reach. Instead, she became separated from a clearly marked trail by what may have begun as only a few mistaken steps. Those few steps proved impossible to reverse. More than a decade later, hikers passing through the 100-mile wilderness often remember the lessons her story left behind. The forest appears peaceful, the white blazes remain easy to follow, and the silence feels almost comforting until one imagines how quickly familiar surroundings can become unfamiliar. Jerry's disappearance is no longer a mystery in the sense of not knowing where she was found, but the deeper question remains unresolved. No one can say with certainty which decision first carried her away from the trail, or why every subsequent effort led her farther from the people searching desperately for her. Somewhere between a routine stop and a vanished trail, Geraldine Largay left behind a mystery that still echoes through the Appalachian Trail. The double murder at Thelma Marks Shelter. Few places along the Appalachian Trail are built with more trust than its wooden shelters, where complete strangers routinely share the same roof beneath the silence of the mountains. They are among the trail's oldest traditions, offering little more than a raised platform, a sturdy roof, and protection from rain, yet generations of hikers have relied on them without hesitation. Conversations begin easily inside these structures because everyone arrives carrying the same burdens of distance, weather, and fatigue. In places far removed from roads and towns, the shelters represent something more than simple accommodation. They are symbols of cooperation in a wilderness where mutual respect has long been considered one of the unwritten rules of the trail. That sense of security, however, would be permanently shaken by events that unfolded in one Virginia shelter during the spring of 1981. For decades, those simple structures represented little more than welcome protection from rain, darkness, and exhaustion after miles of difficult walking. Most evenings followed a familiar pattern. Hikers filtered in before sunset, prepared meals, exchanged stories about difficult climbs or approaching weather, then settled into sleeping bags as the forest gradually fell quiet. While disagreements occasionally occurred between strangers sharing close quarters, violent crime was almost unheard of. The Appalachian Trail had developed a reputation as a place where caution remained important, yet trust generally outweighed suspicion. That reputation made what happened at Thelma Mark's shelter especially difficult for both investigators and the hiking community to understand. Everything about the evening of April 11, 1981, initially appeared no different from countless other nights spent inside Virginia's Thelma Mark shelter. Located in the George Washington National Forest, the shelter stood along a remote stretch of the Appalachian Trail, where hikers often stopped after a long day's journey. The surrounding mountains offered spectacular scenery during daylight, but once darkness settled over the ridges, the forest became quiet enough that even small sounds carried through the trees. It was the kind of place where travellers expected isolation, not danger. Among the hikers spending that night were Michael Schul and Laura Susan Ramsey. Both were young, experienced outdoors enthusiasts who'd been enjoying a backpacking trip together along the Appalachian Trail. Friends later described them as responsible and comfortable in the outdoors, qualities that made them well suited for the demands of backcountry travel. There was nothing unusual about their plans, and nothing suggested they had become involved in any conflict before arriving at the shelter. Like countless hikers before them, they simply intended to spend the night before continuing their journey the following morning. Nothing recorded during their final known hours suggested that investigators would soon be examining one of the trail's most disturbing crime scenes. The available evidence indicates the shelter was occupied during the evening, although exactly who came and went over the course of the night proved difficult to establish with complete certainty. Remote shelters rarely have sign-in procedures, surveillance, or reliable witnesses capable of documenting every arrival and departure. Once darkness fell, the surrounding wilderness effectively concealed anyone approaching or leaving the area. Long before detectives understood what had happened, the first signs of tragedy emerged only after other hikers reached the shelter expecting an ordinary stop. Instead of finding a quiet place to rest, they encountered a horrifying scene that immediately made it clear something had gone terribly wrong. Authorities were notified, and law enforcement officers soon began making their way into an area where every piece of equipment, every footprint, and every disturbance of the ground could potentially become evidence. Inside the shelter, the scene immediately told experienced investigators that this had not been an accident or a medical emergency. Michael Schul and Laura Susan Ramsey had both been murdered. The brutality of the attack stood in sharp contrast to the peaceful setting surrounding the shelter. Detectives faced a crime scene exposed to the elements, vulnerable to contamination, and located far from the resources normally available during urban homicide investigations. Every decision had to account for the realities of working deep within the mountains. From that moment onward, every piece of physical evidence became part of an effort to reconstruct a night with no surviving eyewitnesses able to describe exactly what had occurred. Investigators carefully examined the shelter, the nearby trail, and the surrounding woods for anything that might identify the person responsible. Unlike a crime committed inside a controlled building, an outdoor scene presented unique challenges. Weather could erase traces, wildlife could disturb evidence. Other hikers unknowingly passing through before the murders were discovered could complicate the investigation further. Witness interviews gradually established who had been near the shelter before the attack, although certainty remained frustratingly limited. Detectives spoke with hikers who had travelled through the area during the days surrounding the murders, comparing recollections of unfamiliar faces, unusual conversations, and anyone whose behaviour appeared out of place. Yet memories collected after traumatic events often differ in subtle ways. Distances become uncertain, times blur together, and people who seemed insignificant at the time suddenly become important only in hindsight. Unlike many wilderness disappearances, this investigation depended less on finding the victims than on understanding the movements of the living. The Appalachian Trail functions as a narrow corridor stretching across multiple states, with hikers constantly entering and leaving at road crossings, trailheads, and small towns. Someone could spend a night at a shelter before continuing in either direction, making it extraordinarily difficult to determine where to begin looking for a suspect. The very openness that defines the trail complicated the search for whoever had crossed paths with Michael and Laura. As detectives compared timelines, distances, and testimony, one possible sequence of events gradually emerged from the available evidence. investigators concluded that the victims had likely been attacked during the night after settling into the shelter. The isolated location meant there were few opportunities for anyone nearby to hear signs of a struggle or immediately report suspicious activity. By daylight, the attacker had apparently disappeared back into the vast network of trails, roads, and forests surrounding the area. The investigation eventually focused on Randall Lee Smith, a man with a violent criminal history who had been in the vicinity around the time of the murders. Smith became a significant suspect after evidence linked him to the crime, and he was later convicted of the murders of Michael Schul and Laura Susan Ramsey. For law enforcement, the conviction brought legal accountability to a case that had deeply unsettled the hiking community. Yet solving a case in court does not necessarily answer every question that investigators continue to ask afterward. Even after investigators identified the man responsible, important questions refused to disappear as neatly as the official timeline suggested. Detectives could establish many of the broad facts, but some details of that night remain uncertain because there were no surviving witnesses capable of describing every moment leading to the attack. Motive, in particular, has remained difficult to define with complete confidence. Whether the victims were specifically targeted or encountered violence through chance remains one of the aspects that has continued to generate discussion among those familiar with the case. For experienced investigators, cases like this often reveal how incomplete even successful homicide investigations can be. A conviction establishes criminal responsibility, but it does not always provide a complete narrative of human behaviour. Some decisions exist only in the mind of the perpetrator, and when explanations change over time or remain inconsistent, the final picture inevitably contains gaps. Those gaps have helped keep the murders at Thelma Marks Shelter part of broader discussions about violent crime in isolated wilderness settings. The impact extended far beyond the courtroom. Appalachian Trail organizations, park managers, and experienced hikers increasingly recognized that the trail's long-standing culture of trust could not eliminate every risk. The overwhelming majority of hikers would never encounter violent crime, and the trail remained statistically far safer than many people assumed. Nevertheless, the murders prompted difficult conversations about solo travel, personal awareness, and the reality that remote places sometimes attract individuals seeking isolation for reasons very different from recreation. Years later, the case continues to be remembered not simply because 2 lives were taken, but because the setting itself seemed so profoundly incompatible with the violence that occurred there. The Appalachian Trail has always represented endurance, cooperation, and the quiet satisfaction of moving through landscapes that change little from one generation to the next. The events at Thelma Marks Shelter introduced an unsettling reminder that human violence can intrude even into places designed to offer refuge from the outside world. Today, hikers passing through Virginia may know little about the shelter's history unless they deliberately seek it out. The forest has continued its slow, indifferent cycle of growth. Seasons have come and gone, and thousands of backpackers have walked the same stretch of trail where Michael Schul and Laura Susan Ramsey once spent what they believed would be an ordinary night. The mountains reveal no visible trace of what happened there, yet the story has endured through Appalachian Trail history because it challenged assumptions that many hikers had never questioned before. In a landscape where the greatest dangers were usually thought to be weather, terrain, or simple misfortune, this case demonstrated that the most unsettling mysteries can sometimes come not from the wilderness itself, but from the people moving quietly through it. The unanswered questions that still surround the events at Thelma Marks Shelter continue to linger long after the investigation reached its official conclusion. The unsolved killing of Meredith Emerson. Rising above the forests of northern Georgia, Blood Mountain attracts thousands of hikers each year with views that make the Appalachian Trail seem welcoming rather than forbidding. At more than 4,400 feet, it is the highest point on Georgia's section of the trail and one of its most recognizable destinations. Stone steps climb toward broad overlooks, day hikers regularly share the path with long-distance backpackers, and the mountain's popularity creates an impression that solitude rarely lasts for long. Even during quieter seasons, someone is usually only a short distance away. It is precisely that sense of familiarity that has made one case especially difficult to reconcile with the landscape itself. Unlike the isolated wilderness farther north, this stretch of trail rarely feels deserted, even during the quieter months of the hiking season. roads, parking areas, and nearby towns place civilization within easy reach, while the Appalachian Trail passes through terrain that many visitors complete in a single afternoon. Search and rescue personnel generally consider such areas more favourable than remote backcountry because witnesses are more likely to be present and help can often arrive more quickly. Yet experience has repeatedly shown that the presence of other people does not eliminate opportunity, it merely changes the way danger unfolds. On January 1st, 2008, Meredith Emerson set out expecting nothing more remarkable than a day hike with her dog, Ella. 24 years old, she had recently graduated from the University of Georgia and worked in marketing. Friends and family knew her as active, independent, and fond of spending time outdoors. Hiking was not an unfamiliar pursuit, and Blood Mountain was hardly an obscure destination. She parked at the Byron Reese Trailhead, one of the primary access points to the mountain, and began walking with Ella along a route that countless visitors had followed before. Friends knew Meredith as someone who enjoyed challenging trails and approached the outdoors with confidence instead of carelessness. She carried the basic equipment expected for a winter day hike and planned to return the same afternoon. There was nothing unusual about her itinerary, nor anything to suggest that she believed the trip required extraordinary precautions. The mountain was busy enough that she would likely encounter numerous other hikers throughout the day, and in many respects that steady flow of visitors contributed to the feeling that the hike presented little unusual risk. Several hikers later recalled crossing paths with Meredith during the afternoon, making those encounters some of the final verified moments before everything changed. Witnesses consistently remembered seeing her with Ella, and many described the hike as otherwise ordinary. Those observations would later become crucial because they helped investigators establish both her movements and the approximate time frame during which events began to unfold. In a missing person investigation, even seemingly routine encounters can become essential pieces of a much larger puzzle. One unfamiliar figure also drew attention that day, although no one yet understood how significant that encounter would become. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing Meredith interacting with an older man accompanied by a dog. Some noticed conversations between the two. Others sensed an uncomfortable dynamic developing, though nothing they observed clearly indicated that a violent crime was about to occur. At the time, the encounters appeared ambiguous enough that most hikers continued on their way, assuming they had simply witnessed an ordinary disagreement or unwanted conversation between strangers sharing the trail. One witness later described Meredith as appearing uncomfortable during an interaction with the man. Another reported that the individual seemed unusually persistent. These recollections gained significance only after Meredith failed to return home. Like many investigations built around eyewitness testimony, the meaning of those observations changed dramatically once authorities understood they represented some of the last known moments before her disappearance. What initially seemed insignificant became evidence requiring careful examination. By the time Meredith failed to return as expected, concerns spread with unusual speed among both her family and local authorities. Because she had planned only a day hike, there was little reason to believe she had voluntarily extended her trip. Family members reported her missing, and investigators quickly began evaluating the circumstances. Unlike many wilderness disappearances where uncertainty surrounds the point of last contact, Meredith's intended route and starting location were known almost immediately. That information allowed search efforts to begin without the delays that often complicate missing person cases in remote areas. Search teams moved on to Blood Mountain almost immediately, combing trails, wooded slopes, and nearby access points where even a small clue could redirect the investigation. Volunteers, law enforcement officers, and search specialists examined the mountain, while helicopters surveyed the surrounding landscape from above. Because the area remained accessible by multiple trails and roads, investigators considered a range of possibilities, including injury, accidental exposure, or criminal activity. As each hour passed without locating Meredith, the balance gradually shifted toward the last of those possibilities. While volunteers searched the mountain, detectives began assembling witness statements, vehicle descriptions, and every confirmed sighting from the previous day. Rather than relying on a single dramatic discovery, the investigation advanced through the accumulation of small details. Individual hikers remembered conversations, others recalled seeing a particular vehicle near the trailhead. Detectives compared timelines, mapped movements, and identified areas where different witness accounts overlapped. The investigation increasingly resembled the careful assembly of a timeline rather than a simple search through the forest. Evidence recovered during those early stages gradually shifted the investigation away from the possibility of an accident and towards something far more deliberate. Investigators learned that Meredith's vehicle remained at the trailhead, indicating she had never returned to leave under her own power. Witness accounts consistently placed her with the same unidentified man during the afternoon. Those converging details suggested that finding the man seen speaking with Meredith had become one of the investigation's highest priorities. As detectives expanded their inquiry beyond the mountain itself, information from multiple jurisdictions began forming a clearer picture. Law enforcement agencies shared witness descriptions and investigated leads extending beyond the immediate search area. Public appeals generated additional information from people who believed they had seen either Meredith or the unidentified man. Each verified detail narrowed the possibilities, gradually transforming an unexplained disappearance into a focused criminal investigation. Attention eventually centered on Gary Michael Hilton after evidence connected him to the case. Investigators linked him through witness accounts and other investigative findings that increasingly aligned with the timeline they had constructed. Hilton had traveled extensively through areas frequented by hikers, allowing him to move without immediately attracting unusual attention. The realization that investigators were dealing with an experienced offender fundamentally changed the direction of the case, replacing hopes of a straightforward rescue with the growing likelihood that Meredith had become the victim of a violent crime. The investigation eventually reached a grim turning point when Hilton led authorities to Meredith Emerson's body in Dawson County, Georgia. Medical examiners determined that she had been killed several days after her disappearance. Investigators later established that she had initially been kept alive, a fact that added another painful dimension to the case and raised difficult questions about the decisions made during those intervening days. Although the discovery ended the uncertainty surrounding Meredith's fate, it marked the beginning of another effort to understand how such a crime had unfolded so close to one of the Appalachian Trail's busiest sections. Court records and investigative findings later established many of the central facts surrounding the case. Hilton pleaded guilty to Meredith's murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty and receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His admissions resolved numerous legal questions that investigators had pursued during the search, yet the broader circumstances surrounding his activities remained deeply unsettling. Authorities would later connect him to additional murders in separate cases, demonstrating that Meredith's death had not been an isolated act of violence. Even with a conviction secured, investigators and experienced hikers continued reflecting on how the circumstances had unfolded in such a heavily travelled location. Blood Mountain had not concealed Meredith through vast distances or extreme remoteness. Instead, the crime exposed how quickly an encounter between two strangers could escalate despite the presence of other visitors nearby. Witnesses had seen interactions that later became significant, yet none possessed enough information at the time to recognize that a serious crime was developing. It was a reminder that hindsight often reveals warning signs that appear far less obvious in the moment. The case also prompted renewed discussions throughout the hiking community about personal safety, situational awareness, and the unpredictable nature of encounters on public trails. Outdoor organizations emphasize that violent crimes along the Appalachian Trail remain exceptionally rare when compared with the millions of annual visits the trail receives. Even so, Meredith's case demonstrated that rarity offers little comfort to those directly affected. A popular destination, frequent foot traffic, and daylight hours had not prevented a determined offender from exploiting a brief window of opportunity. Today, hikers crossing Blood Mountain often pass through the same landscape without realizing how profoundly one case reshaped perceptions of safety along this popular section of the Appalachian Trail. The overlooks remain crowded during favorable weather. Photographs continue to capture the mountain's sweeping views, and long-distance hikers still celebrate reaching Georgia's highest point on the trail. From the outside, very little appears different. Yet beneath the familiar routines of one of the Appalachian Trail's best-known destinations lies a case that continues to be studied, not only because of its tragic outcome, but because it demonstrated how danger can emerge where people least expect it, even in places that seem constantly occupied by others. The lasting questions surrounding Meredith Emerson reach beyond one crime, leaving Blood Mountain with a history that still feels unsettling to those who know it. The mystery of the Dartmouth murders. Not every campsite hidden among the forests of northern New England is remembered for the people who stayed there, but some become known for what investigators could never fully explain. Most nights pass unnoticed, marked only by the fading glow of a campfire and the sounds of wind moving through the trees. The landscape around the northern Appalachian Trail has long attracted hikers seeking quiet, hunters travelling deep into the woods, and campers looking for a place beyond the reach of busy roads. It is a setting where solitude is expected rather than feared. Yet in 2001, one campsite near the trail became the starting point of a homicide investigation, whose unanswered questions would linger long after arrests and convictions brought the case into the courtroom. Across the wooded hills surrounding the Appalachian Trail near Dartmouth, overnight camps have long been part of the landscape for hikers, hunters, and outdoor travellers alike. The region straddling New Hampshire and Vermont combines remote forests with nearby communities, creating an unusual balance between wilderness and civilization. A person can leave a paved road, walk only a short distance into the trees, and suddenly find themselves surrounded by silence. That contrast has always been part of the area's appeal. It also meant investigators would have to consider whether the isolation of the campsite had been chosen deliberately, or whether it had simply become the location where opportunity presented itself. Late in the summer of 2001, one quiet campsite unexpectedly became the focus of a homicide investigation that would draw attention far beyond New Hampshire. On August 14th, authorities responded after the bodies of two campers were discovered near their campsite in the town of Hanover. The location lay only a short distance from the Appalachian Trail, a route travelled each year by thousands of hikers. News of the killing spread quickly because violent crime of this nature was exceptionally uncommon in an area better known for outdoor recreation than homicide investigations. The victims, John Jack Donovan and Half Zantop, had chosen the area expecting little more than a peaceful night outdoors. Donovan, a professor at Dartmouth College, and Zantop, also affiliated with Dartmouth, were experienced outdoorsmen who frequently spent time hiking and camping. Friends later described both men as familiar with the region and comfortable in backcountry settings. Their decision to camp near the trail was neither unusual nor spontaneous. It reflected the ordinary routines of two people who appreciated the forests surrounding the college community. At first, nothing publicly known about their plans suggested they faced an unusual risk before arriving at the campsite. There was no evidence that either man anticipated danger or believed they were being followed. They had packed for an overnight stay, established their camp, and settled into what should have been another routine excursion. Investigators later found no indication that they had gone into the woods expecting anything other than the quiet isolation that had drawn countless visitors there before. Early reports from the scene immediately raised questions that investigators could not answer with certainty. Donovan and Zantop had both suffered fatal injuries, making it immediately clear that their deaths were the result of a violent attack rather than an accident or natural causes. Detectives secured the campsite and began documenting every available detail, aware that outdoor crime scenes present challenges rarely encountered inside buildings. Weather, wildlife, and the passage of time can all alter evidence before investigators arrive, while the absence of surveillance cameras or nearby witnesses often leaves physical evidence carrying much of the investigative burden. Detectives quickly realized that understanding the sequence of events would prove far more difficult than documenting the crime itself. The campsite offered clues, but it did not provide a complete narrative. There were signs that suggested interaction between the victims and whoever approached them, yet reconstructing exactly how those encounters unfolded required investigators to distinguish between confirmed evidence and reasonable inference. Without eyewitnesses, every conclusion depended upon how individual pieces of evidence fit together. No single explanation accounted for every piece of evidence collected during the opening stages of the investigation. One possibility considered by detectives was robbery. Another involved the chance that the victims had encountered strangers whose intentions changed unexpectedly. Investigators also examined whether either man had been specifically targeted because of his professional or personal life. Each theory initially appeared plausible, yet none explained every known fact. As the investigation continued, detectives repeatedly found themselves revising assumptions that had seemed convincing only days earlier. The possibility of a random attack attracted considerable attention because of its implications. If the victims had simply encountered strangers while camping, investigators faced the unsettling prospect that the offender could strike again without warning. At the same time, evidence failed to clearly support a carefully planned assassination, or a crime driven by a long-standing personal grievance. The uncertainty surrounding motive complicated nearly every investigative decision. Determining why the attack occurred was essential to determining who should become the primary focus of the investigation. Each new interview added useful details while simultaneously introducing fresh uncertainties that complicated the emerging timeline. Detectives spoke with residents, outdoor enthusiasts, and individuals who had been in the surrounding area before and after the killings. Some recalled unfamiliar people moving through the region, others described vehicles that appeared out of place. While many tips ultimately proved unrelated, investigators recognized that seemingly insignificant observations sometimes become essential once combined with additional evidence. The challenge lay in separating meaningful information from coincidence. Physical evidence gradually narrowed the field of possibilities. Investigators recovered items believed to be connected to the crime and followed leads extending beyond New Hampshire. Cooperation between multiple law enforcement agencies became increasingly important as detectives traced movements across state lines. The investigation eventually focused on two young men, James Parker and Robert Tulloch, whose activities before and after the killings attracted growing scrutiny. As evidence accumulated, detectives concluded that the pair had travelled through the region carrying weapons and had become linked to the campsite through both physical and circumstantial evidence. The arrests marked a major breakthrough, but they did not instantly resolve every uncertainty surrounding the case. During interviews and legal proceedings, differing accounts emerged regarding planning, responsibility, and individual actions. Determining precisely how decisions had been made before the attack proved difficult, because statements changed over time and did not always align perfectly with other evidence. Like many homicide investigations involving multiple suspects, reconstructing the complete sequence of events remained more complicated than identifying those responsible. Physical evidence eventually strengthened the prosecution's case, while additional investigative work helped establish the broader circumstances surrounding the killings. Parker and Tulloch ultimately entered guilty pleas to reduce charges that included second-degree murder. Their plea agreements spared the victims' families the uncertainty of lengthy trials, while providing legal accountability for the crimes. Even so, plea agreements often leave portions of a case unexplored in open court, because the primary objective becomes securing convictions rather than resolving every remaining factual dispute. Although the legal process reached its conclusion, investigators and observers continued reflecting on aspects of the case that remained difficult to fully explain. Questions persisted about motive, particularly whether the violence developed spontaneously or reflected intentions formed before the encounter. Some investigators believed robbery had been a significant factor, while others noted that the available evidence left room for debate about how events escalated. The difference may appear subtle, but understanding motive often shapes how future crimes are prevented and how investigators interpret offender behaviour. The Dartmouth murders also highlighted how crimes committed near wilderness recreation areas differ from those occurring in cities. A campsite may appear secluded, yet it exists within a constantly changing environment where visitors arrive and depart without formal records. Potential witnesses often know one another only by first names or trail names, making later identification difficult. Foot traffic changes daily, and people travelling long distances may never realise they crossed paths with someone who later became relevant to an investigation. These realities complicate even well-resourced inquiries, especially when investigators must reconstruct events after valuable hours have already passed. More than 2 decades later, the case continues to invite careful examination, because it demonstrated that successful criminal investigations do not always eliminate uncertainty. Law enforcement identified those responsible, secured convictions, and established many of the central facts. Yet certain aspects of the crime remain known only through incomplete testimony and evidence that cannot fully reveal the thoughts or intentions behind every decision. Like many complex homicide investigations, the official record answers the most important legal questions, while leaving some human questions permanently unresolved. Rather than fading into history, the Dartmouth murders have remained a reminder that even carefully investigated crimes can resist complete explanation. The campsite has long since returned to the quiet routine of changing seasons, and hikers continue travelling nearby sections of the Appalachian Trail without encountering anything that hints at what once occurred there. The forest preserves no visible record of the violence, but the investigation continues to be studied because it illustrates how certainty is sometimes achieved only in part, even after years of determined investigative work. The Dartmouth murders still leave investigators and hikers alike wondering whether every part of the story was ever truly uncovered. Dennis Martin and the Wilderness Connection. Every Father's Day weekend, families gather beneath the ancient ridges of the Great Smoky Mountains, expecting memories that will last a lifetime. Picnic areas fill with visitors, campsites come alive with conversation, and trails leading toward high meadows and forested ridgelines carry a steady stream of hikers exploring one of America's most visited national parks. The mountains are vast, but they rarely feel empty. Their popularity creates an impression that help is never far away and that becoming completely lost is unlikely. Yet the same landscape that welcomes millions of visitors each year has also produced one of the oldest and most enduring missing person cases associated with the wilderness surrounding the Appalachian Trail. Across the forests surrounding Cades Cove and Spence Field, laughter, campfires and well-travelled footpaths usually make the national park feel far less isolated than its maps suggest. The Appalachian Trail passes through the Great Smoky Mountains for more than 70 miles, crossing high elevations, dense spruce fir forests, and open balds that have drawn hikers for generations. Although the trail would not be formally completed until later in 1969, this section of the mountains was already one of its best-known corridors. Families, backpackers, and campers often found themselves sharing the same landscape, making the area seem both wild and reassuringly familiar. It was in that setting that an ordinary holiday weekend took an unexpected turn. For a few ordinary minutes on June 14, 1969, nothing appeared unusual about the Martin family's camping trip. 6-year-old Dennis Martin had travelled with relatives to the Spence Field area near the Tennessee-North Carolina border to spend Father's Day weekend in the mountains. Like countless children visiting national parks, he was surrounded by family members, open spaces, and opportunities to explore. The campsite overlooked a landscape that many considered among the most beautiful in the park, with grassy clearings bordered by thick forest and nearby trails winding through the mountains. 6-year-old Dennis Martin joined several other children in a simple game that would soon become the defining moment of one of America's oldest missing person mysteries. According to family members, the children decided to hide behind nearby bushes and surprise the adults waiting at the campsite. It was the kind of harmless game that could happen at almost any family gathering. The children split into groups and disappeared briefly into the vegetation before returning toward the campsite from different directions. When the children emerged from the woods, one of them did not return. At first, no one believed anything extraordinary had happened. Family members assumed Dennis had wandered a little farther than the others or had become distracted while playing. Adults immediately began calling his name and searching the surrounding area, expecting to find him nearby. The terrain around Spence Field included open grass mixed with patches of dense forest, allowing someone to disappear from view surprisingly quickly without travelling a great distance. Even so, there was every reason to believe the search would end within minutes. Park rangers responded almost immediately, believing the search would likely end before darkness settled over the mountains. Missing children are often found close to the point where they were last seen, particularly when the disappearance is reported without delay. Rangers organise systematic searches around the campsite while expanding outward in carefully planned patterns. Trails, clearings, streams, and likely travel routes received immediate attention. Every passing hour increased the urgency, but optimism remained strong that Dennis would soon be located. What began as a routine missing child response quickly expanded into an operation unlike anything the Great Smoky Mountains National Park had experienced before. As additional personnel arrived, the search area widened dramatically. Rangers requested assistance from neighbouring agencies, volunteers answered calls for help, and experienced outdoorsmen joined the effort. The disappearance quickly became national news, drawing attention far beyond the Smokies because of both Dennis's age and the speed with which he had apparently vanished. Within hours, volunteers, law enforcement officers, and experienced search personnel were spreading across steep ridges, dense forests, and narrow valleys surrounding the point where Dennis was last seen. Searchers formed long lines designed to sweep through the wilderness methodically, attempting to ensure that no section of forest went unexamined. They searched ravines, checked streams, climbed rocky slopes, and inspected thick patches of rhododendron where visibility sometimes dropped to only a few feet. The terrain repeatedly demonstrated how deceptive the mountains could be. Distances that appeared short on a map became exhausting climbs through tangled vegetation, fallen timber and uneven ground. As the operation continued to grow, the number of people involved reached extraordinary levels. More than 1,000 individuals eventually participated in the search, making it one of the largest missing person operations in American history at that time. Members of the National Guard joined park personnel and volunteers. Experienced trackers examined the ground for footprints or broken vegetation. The scale of the response reflected a widespread belief that Dennis had to be somewhere within the surrounding wilderness, and that such a large effort would inevitably uncover evidence. Helicopters soon joined the effort, while specialized military personnel, including Green Berets, were brought in to assist with the increasingly complex search. Aircraft surveyed ridgelines and valleys from above, looking for movement or clothing that might stand out against the forest canopy. Military personnel contributed survival expertise and navigation skills suited to rugged terrain. Search coordinators divided the landscape into sectors, assigning teams to areas based on probability rather than guesswork. Every new resource strengthened confidence that the search would eventually succeed. Search dogs repeatedly followed promising scents, yet each apparent breakthrough ended without locating Dennis or establishing a reliable direction of travel. Bloodhounds tracked scent trails through sections of forest before abruptly losing them. Investigators considered whether changing weather, difficult terrain, or heavy foot traffic from searchers themselves had disrupted the dog's ability to continue. Each interrupted trail represented another possibility that could not be fully explained. Rather than narrowing the search, these developments often forced teams to widen it again. Natural conditions complicated nearly every aspect of the operation. Afternoon rain affected ground conditions, while the movement of hundreds of searchers inevitably altered the landscape they were trying to examine. The Great Smoky Mountains are known for rapidly changing weather, dense undergrowth, and steep elevation changes that can hide even large objects from view. Search coordinators later acknowledged that maintaining organization across such a vast area became increasingly difficult as more people joined the effort. The very size of the search, while necessary, also introduced new logistical challenges. Several witnesses later reported observations that investigators examined carefully, although none produced evidence capable of resolving the disappearance. One of the most frequently discussed accounts came from the Key family, who reported seeing an unidentified, disheveled man carrying what appeared to be a small child on his shoulder, not long after Dennis disappeared. According to their statements, the man moved quickly through the woods before disappearing from sight. Investigators interviewed the witnesses and evaluated the account as part of the broader investigation. Despite extensive efforts, however, the reported sighting could never be conclusively connected to Dennis Martin. Other reported clues proved equally difficult to verify. Searchers occasionally discovered marks on the ground or indications that someone might have passed through an area, yet none developed into definitive evidence. Reports of possible sightings arrived from locations well beyond the original search area, requiring investigators to determine whether they represented genuine leads or mistaken observations. Each report carried the possibility of a breakthrough, but each ultimately failed to provide the certainty the investigation desperately needed. As days turned into weeks, confidence gradually gave way to uncertainty despite the unprecedented scale of the search operation. The expectation that Dennis would be found nearby slowly diminished as search teams exhausted one section of wilderness after another without success. Eventually, officials scaled back active operations, although the investigation itself remained open. Family members continued hoping that new information might emerge, while investigators reviewed the evidence repeatedly in search of details that might have been overlooked. The disappearance generated numerous theories over the decades that followed. Some suggested Dennis may have become lost and succumbed to the harsh mountain environment. Others considered the possibility of accidental injury in terrain difficult for searchers to access. The reported sighting of the unidentified man fueled speculation about abduction, while additional theories proposed encounters with wildlife despite the absence of evidence supporting such conclusions. None of these explanations has ever been confirmed, and investigators have never identified evidence sufficient to establish exactly what happened after Dennis disappeared from sight. The case also influenced how future searches were conducted within national parks and other wilderness areas. Search and rescue organizations studied the operation to better understand the challenges posed by rugged terrain rapidly expanding search zones and large numbers of volunteers. Advances in mapping, communication and search management have since transformed wilderness rescue efforts, but Dennis Martin's disappearance remains a reminder that even enormous resources cannot always overcome the limitations imposed by geography and time. More than half a century later, the disappearance remains closely connected to the Appalachian Trail because it unfolded within the same mountain wilderness that millions of hikers continue to visit every year. Backpackers crossing the Smokies today follow a route that passes through landscapes little changed since 1969. Open bald still overlook distant ridges, dense forests still conceal narrow footpaths, and families continue gathering in many of the same places where Dennis once played. The mountains have preserved their beauty, but they have also preserved one of their deepest mysteries. Despite one of the most extensive search operations ever mounted in the United States, no definitive trace has ever explained how a 6-year-old boy vanished so completely from a place filled with people searching almost from the very beginning. The unanswered disappearance of Dennis Martin remains one of the Great Smoky Mountains' most enduring mysteries, still resisting every search for certainty: the Appalachian Trail killer. Most hikers never remember the countless strangers they pass along the Appalachian Trail, because nearly every encounter ends as quietly as it begins. A greeting on a narrow path, a brief conversation while filtering water, or a shared shelter for a single night usually becomes nothing more than another passing memory. The trail has always encouraged that kind of temporary community. People arrive from different states, walk together for a few miles or a few days, then separate without expecting to meet again. For generations, that rhythm helped define the Appalachian Trail. It also created an environment where someone could move among hikers without attracting unusual attention, leaving little reason for anyone to remember a face that would soon disappear beyond the next ridge. Each passing conversation, shared shelter, or brief exchange on the trail usually disappears into memory before the next mountain comes into view. Unlike towns or neighborhoods, long-distance trails are constantly changing. New hikers arrive each day while others leave at road crossings, making unfamiliar faces an ordinary part of the experience. That constant movement complicates investigations whenever crimes occur. Witnesses often know one another only by trail names, and descriptions of strangers may be limited to clothing, backpacks, or the direction someone was walking. Individually, those details rarely seem important. Only later do they begin to form a larger picture. At first, investigators had little reason to believe that several violent crimes committed in different places belonged to the same story. Law enforcement agencies naturally approached each investigation according to its own evidence, location, and circumstances. Murders committed in different states are not automatically linked, especially when victims do not appear to know one another. Detectives working one case often have no immediate reason to suspect that another agency, hundreds of miles away, is examining evidence connected to the same offender. In the early stages, each crime appeared to stand on its own. One case alone could be explained as an isolated tragedy, but multiple investigations gradually began revealing unsettling similarities. Victims shared certain characteristics. They had been spending time in or near well-known outdoor recreation areas. Several encounters began as seemingly ordinary interactions between strangers before escalating into violence. Investigators also noted that the offender appeared comfortable moving through forests, trail systems, and public lands where people frequently arrived alone or in small groups. None of those observations proved a connection by themselves, but together they encouraged detectives to look beyond the boundaries of individual investigations. Gradually, comparisons between witness accounts, timelines, and physical evidence started narrowing the list of possible explanations. Detectives from different jurisdictions exchanged information, reviewing reports that previously seemed unrelated. A description provided in one state echoed an interview conducted elsewhere. Vehicle information that appeared insignificant in one investigation became more meaningful after another agency reported similar details. The process was slow because each piece of evidence required independent verification. Rather than producing a dramatic breakthrough, the investigation advanced through careful comparison of facts collected over months. Only after detectives examined information across state lines did one recurring name begin attracting sustained attention. Gary Michael Hilton had spent years traveling through the southeastern United States and was familiar with national forests, hiking trails, and public recreation areas. Investigators learned that his movements repeatedly placed him near locations where violent crimes had occurred. Establishing those movements required assembling records, interviews, and physical evidence from multiple jurisdictions rather than relying on a single witness or isolated clue. The more detectives compared timelines, the more difficult it became to dismiss the similarities as coincidence. Evidence from separate investigations increasingly pointed toward Gary Michael Hilton, whose movements overlapped with several crimes committed near popular hiking areas. The investigation surrounding Meredith Emerson's disappearance became particularly significant because investigators were able to identify Hilton through witness statements, forensic evidence, and subsequent investigative work. Once his identity became known, detectives revisited earlier cases to determine whether they reflected the same methods or circumstances. The focus shifted from solving one crime to understanding the full extent of Hilton's activities. Authorities eventually connected Hilton to the murders of Meredith Emerson in Georgia, John Bryant in North Carolina, and Irene Bryant in North Carolina, as well as the murder of Cheryl Dunlap in Florida. Although these crimes occurred in different places and involved different victims, investigators concluded that important patterns linked them. Hilton traveled frequently, selected locations where people expected solitude, and exploited environments that complicated both witness identification and immediate law enforcement response. Each case contributed additional insight into how he operated across multiple states. Rather than solving a single murder, investigators now faced the larger challenge of determining how many crimes might ultimately be connected. Detectives reviewed unsolved cases, examined travel records, and compared evidence with earlier investigations involving attacks near wilderness areas. As with many serial crime investigations, determining the total number of victims proved more complicated than proving responsibility for specific murders. Law enforcement agencies remained cautious about attributing additional crimes without sufficient evidence, recognizing that speculation could undermine legitimate investigative findings. Several surviving witnesses later described encounters that had seemed merely uncomfortable until the broader investigation placed those moments in a very different context. Some hikers remembered conversations with an older man who lingered longer than expected, or appeared unusually interested in people traveling alone. Others recalled crossing paths with someone whose behavior struck them as odd, but not immediately threatening. None of those encounters necessarily indicated criminal intent when they occurred. It was only after Hilton's arrest that many witnesses reconsidered experiences they had previously dismissed as insignificant. Looking back through earlier reports, detectives found repeated examples of ordinary interactions that acquired new significance only after Hilton's arrest. Witness statements collected during different investigations often contained small observations that seemed unrelated at first. A description of clothing, a vehicle parked near a trailhead, or an individual carrying particular equipment. Standing alone, these details offered little investigative value. Combined across multiple cases, however, they helped reinforce a consistent picture of a man who repeatedly moved through outdoor recreation areas while attracting remarkably little sustained attention. Court proceedings eventually established legal responsibility for multiple murders, bringing certainty to several investigations that had once appeared unrelated. Hilton pleaded guilty to Meredith Emerson's murder in Georgia, and later received additional convictions connected to other victims. The legal outcomes provided answers to many of the questions investigators had pursued for years, but they did not erase the uncertainty that had existed while the crimes remained unconnected. For detectives, the convictions represented the conclusion of a lengthy process built upon cooperation between agencies, rather than a single decisive breakthrough. Beyond the convictions, investigators continued evaluating whether fragmented information had delayed recognition of the wider pattern. Serial investigations often benefit from hindsight in ways unavailable during their earlier stages. Detectives working separate cases naturally focus on local evidence before broader connections become apparent. The Hilton investigations illustrated both the strengths and limitations of modern criminal investigations. Information sharing ultimately revealed the pattern, but only after multiple agencies accumulated enough evidence to recognize that they were pursuing the same offender from different directions. The broader impact reached well beyond law enforcement. Outdoor organizations and hiking communities emphasized practical awareness rather than fear, reminding visitors that violent crime along the Appalachian Trail remains exceptionally rare despite the attention generated by high-profile cases. millions of people continue to hike portions of the trail each year without incident. Even so, Hilton's crimes permanently altered conversations about personal safety, particularly regarding encounters with unfamiliar individuals in isolated areas. The emphasis shifted toward trusting instincts, sharing travel plans, and recognizing that even well-traveled trails require thoughtful judgment. Far more than any single crime scene, the combined investigations demonstrated how easily an unfamiliar face can pass unnoticed through a landscape built on constant movement. The Appalachian Trail itself did not become more dangerous because of one offender, nor did the culture of mutual respect disappear. What changed was the understanding that familiarity with the outdoors does not eliminate human risk. Hikers still exchange greetings with strangers, share shelters during storms, and help one another across difficult terrain. But many now carry a greater appreciation for the importance of observation and communication. The lessons drawn from these investigations came not from abandoning trust altogether, but from recognizing that vigilance and community can exist side by side. The investigation into Gary Michael Hilton continues to leave one unsettling question behind. How many warning signs only became visible after the pattern was finally recognized? The disappearance of Jacob Inchworm Gray. Long-distance trails rarely end when the walking stops, because every journey leaves behind a record waiting to be retraced. Backpackers sign trail registers, exchange conversations at shelters, post photographs, and leave digital traces through phones, cameras, and electronic devices. Even those seeking solitude inevitably create a timeline that others can follow long after they have disappeared around the next bend. Modern hiking has made complete anonymity increasingly difficult, yet every so often, an experienced traveller reaches a point where that record abruptly ends, leaving investigators with a trail of evidence that grows strangely incomplete. Unlike earlier generations of backpackers, today's hikers often document their progress through messages, photographs, GPS data, and trail registers. These fragments rarely tell the whole story, but together they usually establish where someone has been when they arrived, and where they intended to go next. Search and rescue teams have come to rely on these records because they often narrow vast wildernesses into manageable search areas. In many cases, technology succeeds where memory alone once failed. The disappearance of Jacob Inchworm Gray would demonstrate that even in an age of constant documentation, important moments can still vanish without explanation. Jacob Gray was an experienced long-distance hiker whose ambition extended well beyond weekend backpacking trips. A former Marine, he had developed a reputation among fellow hikers for embracing demanding routes that required both endurance and careful planning. His trail name, Inchworm, reflected the hiking culture of the Appalachian Trail, where nicknames often become more familiar than legal names. Friends described him as someone who genuinely enjoyed extended journeys through remote landscapes, rather than brief recreational outings. Experience, however, has never guaranteed certainty in the wilderness, and Gray understood better than most that preparation reduces risk without eliminating it. Years of backpacking had given Gray the confidence to undertake difficult routes alone, while remaining disciplined about the practical demands of long-distance travel. In early 2017, he was hiking sections connected to the Appalachian Trail corridor in northeastern Tennessee. The region combines rugged mountains, dense forests, and an extensive network of trails that intersect with public lands, roads, and small communities. Thousands of hikers pass through these mountains every year, creating an environment where isolation and human activity exist surprisingly close together. It was the kind of landscape Gray had successfully navigated many times before. By the time his final confirmed movements were established, investigators believed they possessed the beginning of a timeline that would eventually reveal the rest of the story. On April 8, 2017, Gray was last seen near the Appalachian Trail in the area of the Iron Mountain Gap Trailhead in Carter County, Tennessee. His vehicle remained parked where he had left it, suggesting that he had entered the mountains intending to return after completing his hike. At first, there was little reason to suspect that anything extraordinary had happened. Experienced hikers sometimes adjust routes, spend additional time outdoors, or encounter delays that interrupt expected schedules. Concern developed only after Gray failed to reappear. Instead, the investigation unfolded through isolated discoveries that refused to fit neatly together. Search efforts began after Gray was reported missing, drawing together local authorities, volunteers, and experienced search personnel familiar with the surrounding terrain. Investigators examined known access points, reviewed the route he had intended to follow, and searched areas where an injured hiker might reasonably be expected to seek shelter. Unlike cases in which the point of disappearance remains uncertain, searchers possessed a relatively clear starting location. The challenge was determining what had happened after Gray left it. Each new search effort focused on the expectation that another clue would finally explain the last one. Search teams worked through steep slopes covered with dense vegetation, rocky outcrops and forests where visibility often disappeared within a short distance of established trails. Spring conditions added another layer of difficulty. Fresh growth obscured sections of the landscape, while changing weather complicated efforts to preserve potential evidence. Despite extensive searches, no immediate sign of Gray emerged. The absence of obvious evidence became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the expectation that an experienced hiker should have left some indication of his movements. Abandoned equipment recovered during the investigation complicated the case far more than it clarified it. Searchers eventually located items belonging to Gray, including pieces of hiking equipment that confirmed they were moving through areas connected to his journey. Under ordinary circumstances, recovered gear helps investigators narrow a person's route or determine whether an emergency forced someone to abandon supplies unexpectedly. In Gray's case, however, the discoveries answered only limited questions. They established that he had been present in the area, but did not reveal why certain items had been left behind or what sequence of events had followed. The location of the recovered equipment prompted investigators to carefully reconstruct Gray's possible movements through the surrounding terrain. Experienced hikers rarely abandon essential gear without compelling reasons, yet wilderness investigations repeatedly demonstrate that injuries, environmental conditions, or rapidly changing circumstances can disrupt even well-considered plans. Detectives and search specialists examined the spacing between recovered items, compared topographic features, and evaluated whether natural obstacles may have influenced Gray's route. None of those efforts produced a single explanation capable of accounting for every known fact. Months later, the discovery of Jacob Gray's remains resolved the question of where he had gone without fully explaining how he had gotten there. In October 2017, his body was found in a remote area of Carter County by hunters. The discovery ended the uncertainty surrounding his fate, but it did not provide investigators with a complete reconstruction of his final journey. The passage of time and exposure to the elements limited the amount of physical evidence available for examination. As in many wilderness investigations, the landscape had preserved some answers while gradually erasing others. Official findings did not identify evidence of foul play, and investigators treated the case as a tragic wilderness death, rather than a criminal investigation. Even so, determining the precise sequence of events remained difficult. Without witnesses to Gray's final hours, investigators relied upon the available physical evidence, terrain analysis, and the documented timeline established before his disappearance. Those sources revealed where the investigation could reasonably reach, but they also marked the point beyond which certainty became impossible. Between the confirmed evidence lay stretches of time that no witness, device, or investigation has ever completely reconstructed. Did Gray encounter an unexpected medical emergency? Did difficult terrain force him onto an unfamiliar route? Did environmental conditions gradually separate him from the path he intended to follow? These possibilities have all been discussed because they reflect challenges commonly encountered in wilderness incidents. Yet no single explanation has been established as the definitive account of what occurred after his final confirmed movements. Rather than producing a single decisive answer, the available facts gradually revealed the limits of what investigators could confidently conclude. Wilderness investigations often create the impression that enough evidence will eventually solve every mystery if the search continues long enough. Gray's case illustrates a different reality. Evidence can survive without preserving context. Objects can remain while the decisions that place them there disappear forever. Even experienced investigators must sometimes acknowledge that the available record has reached its natural limit. Experienced hikers and search specialists have continued examining the case because several aspects resist simple explanation even today. Discussions within the hiking community often focus less on dramatic theories than on practical questions. What circumstances could lead an experienced backpacker away from an intended route? How quickly can difficult terrain transform a manageable situation into a fatal one? Why do some wilderness incidents leave behind detailed evidence while others seem to erase the most important moments completely? These conversations have kept Gray's story alive not because it invites sensational speculation, but because it highlights how even modern investigations can encounter unanswered questions. Perhaps the most unsettling feature of the investigation is how much information survived while the most important moments remained missing. Gray's experience, documented plans, recovered belongings, and eventual discovery all contribute meaningful pieces to the story, yet the brief interval separating his last confirmed movements from the evidence recovered afterward remains largely beyond reconstruction. It is within that gap that the enduring mystery continues to reside, reminding both investigators and hikers that technology, preparation, and experience cannot always preserve the complete history of a journey through the mountains. Few modern Appalachian Trail mysteries illustrate the difference between having evidence and having answers more clearly than Jacob Gray's final journey. The forests of northeastern Tennessee continue to welcome hikers following the same ridges and valleys that Gray once explored, and the Appalachian Trail remains a place where thousands of people safely pursue long-distance adventures every year. His disappearance has not changed the character of the trail, but it has become one of the cases most frequently discussed whenever experienced hikers reflect on the unpredictable nature of wilderness travel. The fragments investigators recovered tell part of the story with remarkable clarity, yet the most important chapter exists only in the silence between those facts. Jacob Inchworm Gray left behind enough clues to begin the story, but never enough to bring it to a complete end. The Lost Hikers of Katahdin. Standing above the forests of northern Maine, Mount Katahdin has long represented both an ending and a beginning for those who reach its summit. For northbound through hikers, it marks the conclusion of a journey stretching more than 2,000 miles from Georgia. For everyone else, it stands as Maine's highest peak and the centerpiece of Baxter State Park, drawing climbers from around the world. After months of imagining the final ascent, many hikers arrive believing the hardest challenges are already behind them. Yet the mountain has repeatedly demonstrated that the last miles of the Appalachian Trail can demand as much caution as everything that came before. No destination along the Appalachian Trail carries greater symbolic weight than the mountain waiting at its northern terminus. The summit sign has become one of the trail's most recognizable landmarks, appearing in countless photographs taken by hikers, celebrating the completion of years of planning and months of walking. Reaching Katahdin is an emotional experience, but emotion can also influence judgment. By the time hikers stand at its base, they're often physically exhausted, mentally focused on a single goal, and eager to finish before weather or daylight forces another delay. Rangers at Baxter State Park have long recognized that the excitement surrounding the mountain can become one of its least visible hazards. Seen from below, Katahdin appears imposing yet attainable, inviting hikers toward a landscape that can change with remarkable speed. Rising more than 5,200 feet above sea level, the mountain dominates the surrounding wilderness with steep granite slopes, exposed ridges, and broad alpine plateaus. Several trails reach the summit, each presenting different challenges, but all require careful attention to footing and weather. Unlike much of the Appalachian Trail, where dense forests provide shelter from wind and rain, Katahdin's upper elevations leave hikers exposed to conditions that can deteriorate with little warning. Weather on Katahdin has earned a reputation for overturning careful plans within a matter of minutes, even during seasons that appear favourable. Warm temperatures at lower elevations can give way to cold rain, dense fog, or powerful winds near the summit. Clouds frequently descend over the mountain, reducing visibility until familiar landmarks disappear into white mist. In those conditions, distances become difficult to judge, cairns marking the route can be harder to locate, and exposed ridges suddenly demand far greater concentration than they did only moments earlier. Experienced mountaineers often describe Katahdin's weather as one of the most unpredictable aspects of the climb, not because storms are unusual, but because of how quickly they develop. The mountain's most famous route, the Knife Edge, illustrates these dangers with unusual clarity. This narrow ridge connects Pamela Peak to Baxter Peak and offers spectacular views under stable conditions. It also exposes hikers to steep drops on both sides, loose rock, and sustained wind. Baxter State Park officials routinely advise visitors to avoid the route during poor weather, because even light rain or fog can transform a demanding scramble into a dangerous undertaking. Although thousands safely cross the Knife Edge each year, rescue reports demonstrate that small changes in conditions can dramatically alter the difficulty of the crossing. Beyond the Knife Edge, Katahdin presents another challenge that many hikers underestimate. The mountain offers very few opportunities to recover from small mistakes once above the tree line. Unlike lower sections of the Appalachian Trail, where dense forests often provide shelter from wind or rain, the exposed granite ridges leave climbers with limited protection when conditions deteriorate unexpectedly. A route that appears manageable beneath clear skies can become considerably more demanding once rain wets the rock or fog obscures the next cairn marking the trail. Rangers frequently encourage hikers to turn back whenever weather begins changing, not because the summit is exceptionally difficult to reach under normal conditions, but because descending safely becomes progressively more complicated as visibility and footing deteriorate. Park records and documented rescue operations reveal that experienced hikers have repeatedly encountered serious trouble on the mountain despite careful preparation. Search and rescue teams have responded to climbers suffering injuries from falls, hikers overcome by exposure, and visitors who became disoriented after weather obscured the route. Many of these individuals carried appropriate equipment and possess significant outdoor experience. Their incidents challenge a common assumption that skill alone guarantees safety in difficult environments. On Katahdin, experience often improves decision-making, but it cannot eliminate every risk created by the mountain itself. One incident after another has demonstrated how quickly visibility, footing, and judgment can deteriorate once conditions begin to shift. In several documented cases, hikers who began their ascent under relatively calm skies later found themselves navigating dense cloud cover or strong winds before reaching the summit. Others underestimated the time required to descend safely after completing the climb. Fatigue becomes an increasingly important factor during these final stages. A hiker who has already spent hours climbing steep terrain must still negotiate technical sections while energy reserves decline and weather continues to change. These circumstances have contributed to numerous rescues and several fatal accidents over the decades. Among the tragedies associated with Katahdin are fatal falls and weather-related deaths involving hikers of varying backgrounds and experience levels. Some incidents occurred after individuals ventured onto exposed terrain during deteriorating conditions. Others involved hypothermia, following unexpected changes in temperature and precipitation. Because every case unfolds under different circumstances, investigators rarely identify a single recurring cause. Instead, official reports consistently point toward combinations of environmental conditions, timing, terrain, and human decision-making. Those combinations differ from one incident to another while producing remarkably similar outcomes. Rescue crews working on Katahdin have often described the same recurring challenges regardless of which hiker they were searching for. The mountain's steep topography limits access in many areas, requiring teams to carry equipment across difficult terrain while responding under the same weather conditions affecting the missing or injured person. Helicopters cannot always operate safely because of fog or high winds, forcing rescuers to continue on foot. Time becomes especially important when cold temperatures threaten hikers suffering from injuries or exposure. Every delay imposed by the mountain itself increases the complexity of the operation. Rescue personnel have often emphasized that time behaves differently on Katahdin than many visitors expect. Carrying an injured climber down steep rocky terrain can require many hours even after the person has been located, while rapidly changing weather may delay helicopters or force rescuers to continue entirely on foot. Every operation demands careful coordination between park rangers, volunteer rescue teams, and medical personnel, all working within conditions that continue evolving throughout the mission. These realities explain why Baxter State Park places such strong emphasis on prevention, encouraging hikers to postpone or abandon summit attempts whenever conditions begin shifting beyond what they originally anticipated. Many experienced backpackers arrive at Katahdin after months of successful hiking, only to face the most technically demanding terrain of their entire journey. Northbound through hikers in particular often reach Baxter State Park after completing nearly every mile of the Appalachian Trail. By then, they have crossed 14 states, climbed hundreds of mountains, and developed confidence through thousands of successful decisions. Yet confidence built over months of hiking through forests does not automatically translate to exposed alpine terrain. Rangers frequently remind visitors that finishing the trail depends not on reaching Katahdin, but on descending from it safely. Unlike the heavily forested stretches farther south, much of Katahdin exposes hikers to wind, rock, and rapidly changing weather with very little natural shelter. Above the tree line, there are few opportunities to escape deteriorating conditions quickly. A storm that develops while a climber is traversing an exposed ridge may leave limited options beyond continuing carefully or retreating over equally difficult terrain. This lack of flexibility distinguishes Katahdin from many other sections of the Appalachian Trail, where forests, shelters, or lower elevations often provide greater protection from the elements. Generations of climbers have left behind remarkably similar accounts of sudden fog, disorienting winds, and conditions that changed faster than expected. These reports span decades and include both successful ascents and incidents requiring rescue. Hikers frequently describe losing familiar landmarks within minutes as clouds envelop the mountain. Others recall wind strong enough to affect balance or temperatures that dropped sharply, despite favourable forecasts earlier in the day. Although such accounts vary in detail, they consistently reinforce the same conclusion. Katahdin rarely rewards complacency. Perhaps the greatest misconception surrounding the mountain is that reaching it means the greatest dangers have already been overcome. For many hikers, the summit represents the emotional conclusion of an extraordinary journey. Celebration naturally follows, but descending safely demands renewed concentration precisely when physical and mental fatigue are often greatest. Park officials have repeatedly emphasized that accidents occur not only during ambitious ascents, but also during descents, when tired hikers may become less attentive to footing, weather, and remaining daylight. In that sense, Katahdin asks its visitors to postpone celebration until the mountain has been left behind entirely. Search and rescue personnel continue studying incidents on Katahdin because many follow familiar patterns despite occurring years apart. Improved weather forecasting, modern navigation devices, and lightweight equipment have unquestionably increased safety, yet they have not eliminated the mountain's capacity to surprise experienced people. Every rescue contributes additional understanding of how terrain, exposure, and decision-making interact under difficult conditions. Those lessons are shared through ranger briefings, hiking organizations, and outdoor education programs, reflecting an ongoing effort to reduce future tragedies without diminishing respect for the mountain's challenges. Although equipment and forecasting have steadily improved, Katahdin continues presenting situations that no technology can completely eliminate. GPS receivers may guide navigation, but they cannot shorten daylight. Satellite communicators can summon help, but they cannot immediately overcome steep terrain or dangerous weather. The mountain ultimately demands the same qualities it always has: patience, humility, and a willingness to turn back when conditions no longer support a safe ascent. Those decisions are often difficult because they require hikers to abandon a goal they may have pursued for months or even years. Those recurring incidents have gradually shaped the culture surrounding Katahdin as much as the mountain itself. Experienced thru-hikers often arrive celebrating the completion of a journey that has taken months to accomplish, yet conversations at nearby campsites frequently include reminders that the Appalachian Trail is not truly finished until the descent is complete. Rangers, trail maintainers, and veteran hikers continue repeating the same advice to new visitors because history has demonstrated that confidence earned elsewhere along the trail must always yield to the conditions waiting on the mountain. Every successful climb reinforces that lesson, while every rescue serves as another reminder that Katahdin demands respect from everyone who approaches it, regardless of experience. Even now, every successful summit shares the landscape with stories that remind visitors how little separates accomplishment from disaster on Katahdin. Most people who climb the mountain return with memories of extraordinary views and a profound sense of achievement. A smaller number leave with experiences shaped by unexpected storms, difficult rescues, or the loss of companions whose journeys ended before they could descend. The mountain itself offers no explanation for why one day remains calm while the next becomes dangerous, or why some experienced hikers safely adapt while others encounter circumstances from which they cannot recover. That uncertainty has become part of Katahdin's enduring reputation, ensuring that its place at the end of the Appalachian Trail is remembered not only for celebration, but also for the respect it continues to demand. Mount Katahdin continues to guard its hardest lessons behind weather, stone, and silence, leaving many of its mysteries unfinished. Voices in the forest. Silence behaves differently after enough days in the wilderness, slowly replacing familiar sounds with an awareness that many hikers struggle to describe. Along the Appalachian Trail, long-distance walkers often spend hours without seeing another person, moving through forests where the loudest sounds may be wind passing through leaves or water, flowing over distant rocks. At first, that quiet feels peaceful. Over time, however, the mind begins adjusting to an environment where every unexpected noise stands out with unusual clarity. It is in those moments that many hikers later recall experiences they found difficult to explain, not because they believed they had encountered something supernatural, but because the ordinary rules they expected the forest to follow suddenly seemed less certain. After prolonged stretches of walking alone, even ordinary noises can begin carrying an unexpected sense of meaning through the forest. Experienced backpackers frequently describe becoming highly attuned to subtle changes in their surroundings. A snapped twig, an echo from a nearby valley, or the rustle of an unseen animal can immediately draw attention after hours of near silence. Outdoor psychologists have long noted that prolonged isolation naturally heightens awareness, an adaptive response that encourages people to notice potential hazards before they become visible. Yet heightened awareness also means that sounds which might be ignored in everyday life are examined far more closely, sometimes creating uncertainty about their true source. Some Appalachian trail hikers have later recalled hearing voices that seemed unmistakably human despite finding no one nearby. These accounts appear throughout trail journals, memoirs, interviews, and conversations shared within the hiking community. The reports vary in detail, but they often follow remarkably similar patterns. A hiker hears what sounds like two people talking somewhere ahead, only to arrive at an empty section of trail. Others describe hearing laughter carried through the trees, despite finding no campsite nearby. Some remember brief calls that seemed too distinct to mistake for birds or wildlife, yet repeated attempts to locate another person produced nothing. Among the most persistent accounts are reports of names being called from beyond the trees, often by people hiking entirely alone. In many cases, hikers insist the voice sounded familiar, almost as though a friend or family member had called from a short distance away. Instinctively, they answered or walked toward the sound before realizing that no one else was present. Similar experiences have been documented in wilderness settings around the world, and researchers have suggested that unusual acoustics, expectation, and the brain's tendency to recognize familiar patterns may contribute to such perceptions. Even so, many hikers remain convinced that what they heard felt different from an ordinary misunderstanding of sound. Mountain landscapes possess acoustic properties capable of producing surprising effects. Valleys can carry voices much farther than expected, while changing air temperatures influence how sound travels across uneven terrain. Under the right conditions, conversations occurring well beyond normal hearing distance may become briefly audible before fading again. At the same time, echoes reflecting from cliffs and ridges can distort direction, making nearby sounds appear distant or distant sounds seem unexpectedly close. These natural explanations account for many reported experiences, yet they do not comfortably explain every account shared by hikers, who later insisted that the voices seemed to move with them through the forest. Occasionally, those same stories include footsteps that appeared to match a hiker's pace, before fading without explanation. Many backpackers have described the unsettling sensation of hearing another set of footsteps behind them while walking through quiet sections of the trail. Whenever they stopped, the sound also seemed to stop. When they resumed walking, it returned. Some eventually turned around expecting another hiker to emerge from the trees, only to find the trail completely empty. Others reported accelerating their pace, convinced someone was following them, before realizing the sounds never became any closer. Environmental conditions offer several possible explanations for these experiences. Dry leaves can continue shifting after a person has passed, especially on sloping ground. Small animals often move through undergrowth at speeds that roughly parallel a hiker's progress without ever becoming visible. Backpacks, trekking poles, and loose equipment can also create rhythms that echo from nearby rock formations, giving the impression that someone else is walking just out of sight. Nevertheless, hikers who describe these experiences frequently emphasize that they first considered such possibilities themselves before concluding that what they heard did not entirely match those explanations. Others describe discovering campsites that looked recently occupied, only to find them abandoned or strangely absent when they returned. A few accounts tell of smoke apparently rising through trees where no campfire could later be located. Others mention seeing tents in fading light before discovering empty clearings after walking only a short distance farther. Because the Appalachian Trail passes through public lands visited by thousands of people every year, recently abandoned campsites are entirely ordinary. yet some reports involve locations where visitors later found no evidence that anyone had camped there at all. These stories remain impossible to verify after the fact, but they have become familiar enough that experienced hikers occasionally mention them, alongside more practical discussions of navigation and weather. Nightfall changes the Appalachian Trail in ways that extend well beyond fading daylight and cooler temperatures. Familiar landmarks become difficult to distinguish, distances appear altered, and ordinary objects assume unfamiliar shapes beneath headlamp beams. Researchers studying perception have shown that the human brain constantly attempts to interpret incomplete visual information, particularly in low light. Shadows become figures, branches resemble movement, and momentary uncertainty often resolves into ordinary explanations once daylight returns. The forest itself has not changed. Human perception has. Environmental psychologists have long noted that prolonged isolation, physical fatigue, and heightened alertness can subtly alter the way people interpret sensory information. Long-distance hikers often spend weeks making continuous decisions about weather, food, navigation, and safety while carrying heavy packs across difficult terrain. Mental fatigue gradually accumulates alongside physical exhaustion. Under those conditions, the brain sometimes responds differently to ambiguous sights and sounds than it would during everyday life. None of this implies that hikers fabricate their experiences. Rather, it illustrates how complex the relationship between environment and perception can become during extended wilderness travel. Trail journals, memoirs, and interviews nevertheless contain remarkable similarities between experiences reported decades apart by hikers who never met one another. Independent accounts repeatedly mention hearing voices where no one was found, sensing unseen company during isolated stretches of trail, or encountering sounds that seem to follow rather than originate from a fixed location. Similar reports appear across different regions of the Appalachian Trail, despite being recorded years apart and often without obvious influence from one another. Whether these similarities reflect common environmental conditions, shared psychological responses, or something else entirely remains difficult to determine. Whether those similarities arise from shared environmental conditions, human psychology, or something less easily understood remains open to interpretation. Scientists generally approach such reports through established principles of perception, acoustics, fatigue, and cognitive processing. Many hikers accept those explanations while still acknowledging that some individual experiences remain deeply unsettling. Others simply conclude that not every unusual moment in the wilderness requires an immediate answer. The absence of certainty does not automatically validate extraordinary explanations, but neither does it erase the genuine impact these experiences have on the people who report them. Perhaps the strangest aspect of these reports is not any individual story, but how consistently the same themes appear throughout Appalachian Trail history. Unlike legends passed through a single community, these accounts emerge from hikers of different ages, backgrounds, and levels of experience. Most have little interest in promoting mystery. Many waited years before mentioning what happened because they assumed no one would believe them, or because they eventually convinced themselves there must have been a simple explanation. Yet when they finally shared their experiences, they often discovered that others had described something remarkably similar. Few hikers claim to understand what they experienced, yet many remain equally certain that the experience itself was real to them. That distinction has helped preserve these stories within Appalachian Trail culture. They are rarely presented as proof of anything extraordinary. Instead, they serve as reminders that wilderness can affect people in ways that are difficult to predict and even harder to describe. Some hikers forget such moments almost immediately after returning home. Others remember them for decades, not because they fear the trail, but because they cannot fully reconcile what they sensed with what they later knew to be true. Across generations of backpackers, these quiet accounts have gradually become part of the unwritten folklore carried from one shelter to the next. They are shared around campfires, mentioned in memoirs, and occasionally discussed by hikers who hesitate before admitting that something about a particular night never quite made sense. Unlike ghost stories told purely for entertainment, these recollections often begin with ordinary observations before drifting into uncertainty. Their power lies not in dramatic conclusions, but in their restraint. Most end without answers, leaving listeners to decide for themselves whether the experience reflected the wilderness, the human mind, or a combination of both. By sunrise, the forest usually appears ordinary again, while the unanswered questions continue travelling with those who leave it behind. Birds return to the trees, familiar landmarks regain their shape, and the trail resumes the quiet rhythm that has guided millions of footsteps across the Appalachian Mountains. The places where unusual experiences were reported rarely look different from any other section of the trail. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to endure. They remind hikers that even after maps have been completed, mountains measured, and forests carefully managed, there remain moments when the most difficult mysteries are not found in what people discover, but in what they remember hearing when no one else seemed to be there. The voices remembered along the Appalachian Trail have never formed a single mystery, but together they continue to echo through its forests without a definitive explanation. The legends hidden along the trail. Centuries before white blazes marked a footpath across the Appalachian Mountains, these ridges already carried stories that were never written down. Long before surveyors mapped passes or conservationists established parks, generations of people crossed these mountains, hunted within their forests, and passed knowledge from one generation to the next through spoken tradition. The Appalachian Trail may be a 20th century creation, but the landscape it follows has accumulated thousands of years of human memory. Every valley, ridge, and river has been known by different names, interpreted through different beliefs, and remembered in different ways. To understand why so many legends remain attached to the trail today, it is necessary to begin with the people who knew these mountains long before the trail itself existed. Across countless generations, the mountains became repositories of oral traditions passed from one community to the next, without maps or books. For indigenous peoples of the Appalachian region, history was not preserved primarily through written records, but through stories that explained places, relationships, and the responsibilities connecting people to the natural world. Oral traditions served practical purposes as well as cultural ones, preserving knowledge about travel routes, seasonal changes, dangerous terrain, and locations of spiritual significance. Although individual stories differed among nations, they shared an understanding that the mountains were far more than empty wilderness waiting to be crossed. Cherokee traditions describe the southern Appalachians not simply as wilderness, but as places where history, identity, and the natural world remained deeply connected. Before the forced removal of many Cherokee people during the 19th century, their homeland extended across large portions of what are now North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and surrounding areas through which the Appalachian Trail now passes. Mountains, rivers, and forests formed part of a living cultural landscape rather than isolated landmarks. Certain places were associated with creation stories, ceremonial practices, or important historical events, while others were approached with particular respect because of their cultural meaning. Modern historians and Cherokee cultural preservation efforts continue emphasizing that these traditions should be understood within their original cultural context rather than through later supernatural interpretations. Rather than separating the physical landscape from the spiritual one, many traditional beliefs treated the mountains with lasting respect and caution. This perspective differs significantly from later frontier ideas that viewed wilderness primarily as territory to be settled or conquered. Within many indigenous traditions, particular locations carried significance because of relationships between people, ancestors, animals, and the environment itself. Those beliefs reflected centuries of observation and experience within the mountains. As later generations encountered unfamiliar places already surrounded by stories, they often interpreted them through their own cultural traditions, gradually creating new layers of folklore built upon much older foundations. As European settlers gradually established isolated communities throughout the Appalachians, they encountered a landscape already rich with older traditions while creating new folklore of their own. During the 18th and 19th centuries, mountain settlements remained separated from one another by difficult terrain, limited transportation, and long winters. News often travelled slowly, and oral storytelling became an important means of preserving local history, as well as providing entertainment during evenings spent indoors. Over time, real events blended with memory, cautionary tales, and personal experience until it became increasingly difficult to determine where documented history ended and legend began. Mountain communities eventually developed stories about strange lights, unexplained sounds, and remote places that generations learned to approach carefully. Some valleys became associated with mysterious lights seen from distant ridges, phenomena that have since attracted both scientific investigation and local storytelling. The Brown Mountain Lights in North Carolina, for example, have been reported since at least the 19th century, inspiring explanations ranging from atmospheric effects to folklore. Scientists have proposed several natural causes for many reported light phenomena, including distant vehicle headlights, atmospheric refraction, and other optical effects. Even so, the persistence of these reports has allowed them to remain one of the Appalachian region's most enduring mysteries. Other traditions centered not on lights but on particular locations where unusual experiences were said to occur repeatedly. Isolated gaps, remote hollows, and abandoned homesteads gradually acquired reputations that extended well beyond the communities nearest to them. Travelers occasionally avoided certain routes after dark because of stories passed down through families, while hunters and woodsmen developed their own collections of local accounts, describing unexpected sounds or unsettling encounters deep within the forest. Most of these stories cannot be independently verified today, yet they illustrate how landscapes often acquire reputations through repeated storytelling, rather than through any single documented event. Over time, those local accounts spread beyond individual valleys, becoming part of the wider folklore surrounding the Appalachian Mountains. As transportation improved and visitors from outside the region became more common, many of these stories travelled with them. Writers collected mountain folklore, newspapers occasionally reported unusual local traditions, and regional historians documented tales that otherwise might have disappeared. Some accounts changed as they spread, adapting to new audiences while retaining recognizable themes. Others gradually merged with older legends until their original sources became impossible to identify. In this way, folklore evolved alongside the communities that preserved it. Many modern hikers unknowingly pass through locations where older legends had already existed for centuries before the Appalachian Trail was ever conceived. Shelters, campsites, and overlooks now visited by backpackers often lie within landscapes shaped by far older histories. Most hikers experience these places simply as beautiful sections of trail, yet the names appearing on maps sometimes preserve fragments of earlier stories whose full origins have largely faded from memory. The mountains do not announce these histories openly. Instead, they remain quietly embedded within place names, historical records, and traditions remembered by local communities. Folklore rarely survives by remaining unchanged, and each generation has quietly reshaped these mountain stories without erasing their oldest foundations. Long-distance hikers have added their own contributions through trail journals, memoirs, and conversations shared at shelters. Modern accounts of unexplained experiences occasionally echo themes that appeared in much older traditions, even when those describing them are unaware of the earlier stories. This does not necessarily imply that the experiences share a common cause. Rather, it illustrates how people repeatedly interpret unfamiliar landscapes through narratives that already exist within the culture surrounding those places. History often preserves uncertainty more effectively than certainty, especially in landscapes where written records were once scarce. Many stories associated with the Appalachian Mountains cannot be traced to a single, identifiable origin because they developed gradually across generations. Historians frequently distinguish between documented events and folklore while recognizing that both reveal important aspects of regional history. A legend does not become historically significant because every detail can be proven. It becomes significant because it demonstrates how communities understood their surroundings, remembered unusual events, and passed those memories forward. Cultural historians have long observed that isolated mountain regions naturally accumulate traditions, blending documented events with remembered experience. Similar patterns appear in mountain communities around the world, where difficult terrain, limited communication, and strong local identities encourage the development of distinctive folklore. The Appalachian Mountains are no exception. Their extraordinary age, ecological diversity, and long history of human occupation have produced a landscape rich in stories reflecting many different cultures, rather than a single unified tradition. Cherokee oral history, frontier folklore, regional customs, and modern hiking culture all contribute to the mountain's evolving identity. Unlike official histories, oral traditions seldom attempt to separate every fact from every mystery, allowing both to exist side by side. A story may preserve an identifiable historical event while surrounding it, with details that cannot be independently confirmed. Another may contain no verifiable origin at all, yet continue to influence how later generations perceive a particular place. This coexistence of history and uncertainty explains why so many Appalachian legends remain compelling. They invite curiosity without demanding belief, encouraging listeners to consider not only what may have happened, but also why people continued telling the story long afterward. Even today, backpackers continue adding new stories to a landscape already shaped by centuries of memory and interpretation. Every hiking season introduces fresh experiences, unexpected encounters, and quiet moments that eventually become conversations shared around shelters or remembered long after the journey ends. Most of these accounts remain personal observations rather than established facts, yet together they extend a tradition far older than the Appalachian Trail itself. Each generation inherits the stories left by those who came before, while contributing new ones for those still to come. What ultimately endures along the Appalachian Trail is not any single legend, but the remarkable continuity of stories carried across generations of travellers. The trail connects mountains separated by hundreds of miles, yet it also connects centuries of human experience within the same landscape. Indigenous traditions, frontier folklore, local history, and modern backpacking culture all exist simultaneously, layered across ridges that have witnessed far more than any written record can fully preserve. Whether viewed as history, cultural memory, or simple storytelling, these legends remind hikers that the Appalachian Mountains have always been more than a route from one place to another. They remain a landscape where every generation leaves behind its own interpretation of what the forests, valleys, and peaks seem to whisper before disappearing once again into silence. The legends hidden along the Appalachian Trail continue to outlive those who tell them, leaving the mountains to guard whatever truth first gave them life. Why the Appalachian Trail still keeps its secrets. Stretching across 14 states, the Appalachian Trail is often imagined as a single path, yet it is more accurately understood as hundreds of different wildernesses connected by one continuous route. It crosses rolling farmland, dense hardwood forests, exposed alpine ridges, remote mountain balds, and some of the oldest landscapes on Earth. Every section presents its own terrain, weather, and challenges, making it impossible to describe the trail as though it were a single environment. A disappearance in Maine unfolds under different conditions than one in Georgia. A storm in the Great Smoky Mountains behaves differently from one on Mount Katahdin. Yet despite these differences, the trail has accumulated an unusually large collection of mysteries whose unanswered questions continue to draw attention, decades after the events themselves. Viewed from above, the forests surrounding the trail appear almost endless, concealing valleys, ridges, and waterways capable of reshaping every investigation that enters them. Satellite imagery reveals a continuous ribbon of green extending across the eastern United States, but those broad images conceal the complexity waiting beneath the canopy. Steep ravines interrupt direct travel, dense vegetation limits visibility, and rock formations create natural barriers that rarely appear on ordinary maps. Search teams entering these landscapes quickly discover that a few hundred yards can require hours to cover. The mountains do not simply separate one location from another. They reshape how people move, what they can see, and how easily they can be found. Geography alone explains more mysteries than many people first realize, especially in landscapes where distance is measured less by miles than by terrain. 2 points that appear close together on a map may be separated by cliffs, tangled undergrowth, fast-moving streams, or steep elevation changes. A lost hiker rarely travels in a straight line, and rescuers seldom search under ideal conditions. Every detour forced by the landscape creates additional uncertainty. By the time investigators begin reconstructing someone's movements, the terrain has already influenced nearly every decision that person may have made. Every season quietly transforms the Appalachian Mountains, altering visibility, weather, vegetation, and even the evidence left behind. Spring conceals the forest floor beneath fresh growth. Summer produces thick foliage that limits sightlines to only a few yards in many places. Autumn covers the ground with leaves capable of hiding footprints, equipment, and subtle changes in the landscape. Winter replaces familiar paths with snow and ice, while introducing cold that rapidly increases the consequences of even minor mistakes. These seasonal changes also affect investigations. Rain washes away tracks, fallen leaves cover disturbed ground, and repeated freeze-thaw cycles gradually erase physical traces that might otherwise have helped reconstruct events. Search specialists have long recognized that finding someone in dense wilderness depends on probability as much as persistence. Modern search and rescue organisations rely upon detailed planning, statistical modelling, behavioural research, and carefully coordinated teams rather than simply spreading volunteers across the landscape. Investigators estimate where a missing person is most likely to travel based on terrain, age, experience, weather, and many other variables. Areas with the highest probability receive attention first, because time remains one of the most important factors in wilderness rescue. Even with these methods, however, probability never guarantees success. It only improves the chances of placing searchers where they are most likely to make a discovery. No amount of preparation can completely eliminate the natural limitations faced by rescuers working across mountains of this scale. Visibility beneath dense forest canopies remains remarkably limited, especially during the growing season. A person lying only a short distance from a search line may remain unnoticed, because vegetation blocks the view from every direction. Helicopters provide valuable aerial support, yet tree cover often conceals the ground almost completely. Search dogs can follow scent under favourable conditions, but weather, water, terrain, and the movement of other people all influence their effectiveness. These limitations explain why even the largest search operations sometimes conclude without locating the person they were organised to find. Human perception changes in subtle ways after prolonged exposure to isolation, physical exhaustion, and unfamiliar surroundings. The Appalachian Trail encourages hikers to become increasingly attentive to their environment, because awareness contributes directly to safety. That heightened attention helps people notice changing weather, shifting terrain, and potential hazards. At the same time, sustained concentration and fatigue alter the way the brain processes ambiguous information. Sounds seem more significant, distances become harder to judge, and decisions that appear straightforward at the beginning of the day may become increasingly complex after hours of continuous effort. Scientific research has repeatedly shown that memory, judgment, and sensory interpretation become less reliable under environmental stress. Fatigue reduces concentration, cold affects decision-making, dehydration slows cognitive processing, and fear can narrow attention toward immediate concerns while obscuring broader situational awareness. None of these responses are unusual. They represent normal human reactions to demanding conditions. Understanding them helps explain why experienced hikers sometimes make decisions that appear surprising in hindsight. Those choices were not necessarily irrational when they occurred. They were made by people responding to circumstances that investigators can later examine only from a distance. Evidence rarely survives untouched in wilderness settings where weather, wildlife, and time continue working long after people have departed. A backpack may shift downhill during heavy rain. Clothing can become buried beneath leaves or snow. Small objects disappear beneath vegetation, while larger items gradually weather until they blend into the surrounding landscape. Animals may disturb personal belongings without any connection to the original event. Even when investigators eventually recover important evidence, they must consider how the environment may have altered its position or condition over weeks, months, or even years. The wilderness does not intentionally conceal answers, but it rarely preserves them unchanged. Stories, by contrast, often endure precisely because they can outlast the physical evidence that first inspired them. Once an event enters public memory, it continues evolving through newspaper articles, books, documentaries, trail conversations, and online discussions. Some details become clearer as additional records emerge, while others grow less certain with repeated retelling. Historians, journalists, and investigators frequently return to older cases, hoping that overlooked information might provide fresh insight. Occasionally, new evidence changes long-standing assumptions. More often, it confirms that some questions remain unanswered because the evidence capable of resolving them no longer exists. Perhaps no single explanation can account for every mystery explored throughout the Appalachian Trail's history. Some disappearances resulted from accidents that unfolded beyond the reach of witnesses. Some crimes were eventually solved through determined investigative work. Other cases revealed the extraordinary difficulty of locating a single person within millions of acres of wilderness. Reports of unusual experiences reflected the complex relationship between perception, environment, and memory, while generations of folklore demonstrated how landscapes preserve cultural stories alongside documented history. Treating all of these mysteries as though they share one cause overlooks the fact that each emerged under different circumstances while being shaped by the same mountains. What ultimately connects these cases is not a common cause, but a common landscape that continually tests both people and the investigations that follow them. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, their slopes shaped over hundreds of millions of years by erosion, climate, and geological change. Human beings have crossed them for thousands of years, yet many sections remain remarkably resistant to easy travel or complete understanding. The trail provides a route through that landscape, but it does not simplify the landscape itself. Every investigation, every rescue, and every journey begins by adapting to the mountain rather than expecting the mountain to adapt in return. Millions of hikers safely experience the Appalachian Trail every year, creating far more ordinary journeys than extraordinary ones. Most complete their trips with little more dramatic than sore muscles, changing weather, and unforgettable scenery. Rangers, volunteers, trail maintainers, and search and rescue organizations work continuously to improve safety through education, maintenance, and emergency response. Their efforts have prevented countless accidents and saved many lives. Remembering that reality is important because the trail's mysteries represent exceptional events rather than ordinary ones. The Appalachian Trail remains one of the world's most celebrated long-distance footpaths precisely because millions have explored it responsibly and returned home with stories defined by accomplishment rather than tragedy. Remaining unanswered does not necessarily make a mystery supernatural, but it does remind us that complete certainty is sometimes beyond even the most determined investigation. Every chapter of this journey has illustrated a different way uncertainty can emerge. A hiker steps only a short distance off the trail and never finds it again. A search involving thousands uncovers remarkably little. Weather transforms a familiar mountain within minutes. Independent witnesses describe experiences that resist easy explanation. Ancient traditions and modern observations become intertwined across generations. Each mystery reflects a different intersection of human experience and wilderness, yet together they reveal something larger than any single case. The Appalachian Trail has never promised certainty to those who walk its length. It offers remarkable beauty, demanding terrain, unexpected hardship, moments of profound solitude, and a connection to landscapes that have changed far less than the people passing through them. Every year, new footsteps join the millions that came before, while the forests continue growing, storms continue passing, and seasons continue reshaping the mountains without regard for the questions people leave behind. That enduring cycle may be the simplest explanation for why so many mysteries persist. The trail keeps moving forward, even when human understanding cannot. Perhaps the Appalachian Trail's greatest mystery is not what happened along its forests, but how so many answers were quietly reclaimed by the wilderness itself.